This is Rob Johnson, the president of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. I'm here today with an extraordinary individual, Dr. Patrick Bond, who he was born in Northern Ireland. He grew up in Alabama, educated on the East Coast, the United States, and then moved to South Africa. I feel like there's a lily pond of global cauldrons, and your curiosity has taken you through a whole series of the places that teach us the lessons that disruption teaches a person who has the courage to look it in the eye. He's a professor of sociology at University of Johannesburg in South Africa. He's written a great deal of really penetrating work on climate change and the role of what we might call the market or neoliberal system and its shortcomings. He's written about climate justice, and he's written about the evolution of the world and what he has referred to in recent presentations as deglobalization, and particular focus on the so-called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Patrick, thanks for joining me today. There's just so many places we can go, and that's all a tribute to the extraordinary work that you've done and the books that you've written and the books and papers you've contributed to.
Great to be with you here from Johannesburg to New York and so many things in between. And I've always learned from Inette and from you and your colleagues. So thanks very much for having me.
Well, thank you. I think my Young Scholars Initiative will delight in the example that you set, and I want to work with you to illuminate that for them here in this next period in our conversation. So let's start with the question of what inspired you to become an economist and what inspired you to focus in South Africa?
Well, I think particularly in the early 1980s, when there was so much despair because of a Volcker shock that put the interest rates up so high, and our student debts were climbing every moment, and the third world debt crisis had broken out in Mexico, yes, Argentina, 1982 and 84. And so as I was getting out of my undergraduate economics degree, it was an opening to ask whether economists really understood what was happening, especially where markets were meant to equilibrate. So as I was curious about power relations, and the economics department I was in, Swarthmore College, had a very strong Keynesian orientation, and I was very fortunate also to do an honors thesis with F.M. Shearer, Fred Shearer, who was in industrial organization, the leader. And that was a moment to say, well, how well are these markets clearing? Walter Wriston said, no, don't worry. He was a Citibank CEO. He said, countries don't go bankrupt. Well, that was very clearly wrong by the early 80s. And similarly, not just north-south, but what I could see as I moved to Philadelphia, I worked in the Fed for a couple of years, doing Community Reinvestment Act, bank examining, trying to figure out where the flows of funds cut off areas like West Philly, where I lived, which was redline. Later, it was going to be subject to predatory lending, too much finance without much care about income and exploding adjustable rate mortgages that wrecked especially African-American households' finances. This is even before the 2007-8 crisis. And I think these are the problems, let's say, of finance out of control. My PhD was about Zimbabwe, uneven Zimbabwe, in which the financial markets over the course of a century helped to explain the broader set of things. So, working in the Fed and moving from Swarthmore to Wharton School of Finance, Ed Herman was my main teacher, a wonderful scholar of power and corporate financial malevolence. And then to David Harvey, my PhD supervisor at Johns Hopkins, in political economy, economic geography. These were windows that helped to clarify, and if I found one place where clarification was needed in 1985 with the fight against apartheid being bogged down and under massive pressure from states of emergency, something extraordinary happened that inspired me and many people, which was that the banks finally succumbed to pressure from protesters. I was one of them, saying you shouldn't greenline the apartheid system while you redline African-American neighborhoods in your own city. So we went all around the US with these campaigns to pull banks out. And suddenly it happened. In September 1985, the government here, under P.W. Botha, the main fascistic prime minister, he actually declared a default. This was even before Brazil's 1987 default. And in that sense, we really saw white business breaking from white racism because finance had become a kind of wedge in there and broken the spirit of that combination. And I felt really by putting pressure on the banks, the financial markets were quick to respond. They certainly were public relations conscious, as we've seen with other divestment strategies, BDS on Israel, and especially the divestment of fossil fuels more recently. And I think those kind of lessons and moving to the most unequal city in the world as it moved out of apartheid, working with community groups in the early 1990s, the civic movement, the sort of world's leading urban social movement, protests all the time. It was quite inspiring, the invigoration of a South Africa going through this transition, having a chance to work in President Mandela's office in 1994 when he needed a fast typist to put the first public policy, the Reconstruction and Development Program together. I was the sort of chief drafter and could really see how this power was playing out. And I think, political economy, later in the early 2000s, when the World Summit on Sustainable Development was hosted here in Johannesburg, becoming also a political ecologist, understanding the ecological aspects and the untenability of our current kind of accumulation process. And then finally, a third factor, political economy, political ecology, but it's ultimately knowledge production as I became a formal academic. Knowledge production that comes from the social movements, the labor movements, the environmentalists, the youth, the women, LGBTQ. These movements have really changed power when they've focused. And an example would be for getting access to AIDS medicines, which had been on patent and therefore unaffordable, breaking through around 2001 in Doha, but basically getting what was then an AIDS denialist president, Thabo Mbeki, to finally start offering generics through the public sector free, 7 million people, and raising life expectancy from 52 to 65. These are some of the highlights, not that I had anything to do with them, but that I could witness, and it shaped the way I've seen power. And I think that's been very valuable, and I hope that the praxis epistemology, knowledge production in the context of intense activism, can continue to become a source of not just inspiration for justice, but also knowledge about how our systems work.
Yes, well, how would I say, your curiosity taking you to these places that were in turmoil tends to, which you might call, it's like muscles. You're exercising the muscles of imagination, and after you see either a failure or you see a tremendous outcome, you can understand a little bit more what possibilities there are, what levers there are for humankind. And one of the things that inspired me to want to talk to you was that I see so much despair right now in relation to climate change in particular, but the pandemic and other things. And to see someone who's actively talking, and I've read things you've done in the last 18 months, which you might call that, what I'll call North Star of hope embedded within it. I think you, how do I say, you exercised your muscles very well. I know you've written a number of books going back now to your going to Africa, Elite Transition from Apartheid to Neoliberalism, which is about South Africa. Another one was it Talk Left, Walk Right. I remember that. That was
that kind of dance our ruling party here is very good at. It's a nationalist dance where you neoliberal economic policies, but the old Soviet era radicalism still.
The Zimbabwe's plunge, the accumulation of capital in South Africa, all of these different. I mean, you've been prolific for years in a realm, and where I want to, how do I say, is we're building a bridge from you to now, and you acting now. My commission on global economic transformation started out by saying we have to focus on what are the disruptors of the world. Finance, technology, globalization, meaning the breakdown of governance as we knew it, and climate. And then people started to talk about migration as an induced disruptor. And then we got a briefing from a young woman from the International Office of Migration, where she said, in the continent of Africa, there is not a development strategy like the East Asian model because of global supply chains and automation, machine learning, where an equatorial region of subsistence farming is going to get fried if we don't make progress on climate change. And by 2075, we anticipate that there will be 5 billion people in the continent of Africa. So they don't have a development strategy. They don't, at least that follows the historic traditions of East Asian infant industry protection and the like. They didn't feel like they knew how to stop climate having a huge impact on the people of that continent. Very large population. And some concern, I mean, even famous scholars like Danny Roderick, that the capital intensity of information-based production will displace labor. It's not a substitute any longer. Others have been a little more optimistic about the ability to work in a knowledge-based, service-based economy. But the transitions in Africa overwhelmed. This is a commission of 20-some people. And they sort of said, can we write about it? Is there anywhere to go? It's so daunting, but it's such a large challenge on the horizon. So you are immersed there. You see all kinds of potentials, corruptions, everything. How can the world help the continent of Africa develop and be a fundamental part of the transformation of climate that we see as necessary for all of us, but particularly for those people?
You know, Rob, you've put so many things there that it's very intimidating. I think if we work on some of the ways Africa is being drained, really truly looted by the North and by the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa bloc, which are often the sort of middlemen in the raw materials part of that value chain, then there's some interesting prospects, because if you think of illicit financial flows, and one United Nations Economic Commission on Africa study is now estimating $148 billion a year, and licit, the interest, profits, the dividends that are flowing out, often for very poorly compensated extraction of our natural resources, which we think, can be contested. If we can get rid of GDP and have a proper measure of what happens in an economy like South Africa or the rest of the continent. And then thirdly, I think what is critical now to raise, in addition to this illicit and licit financial outflows and the depletion of our natural resource base, the third must be what the North and the BRICS owe Africa as a climate debt, the reparations for precisely what you've said. It's what we've seen, say, the last 20 years. 4 countries have really been hit hard. Mozambique next door here, especially with 2 cyclones in 2019, killed more than 1,000, but just really devastated big chunks of Mozambique. And in one of them now, there's a war raging with Islamic-inspired resistance, and Total and ExxonMobil and China National Petroleum and Eni and South Africa's Sasol trying to get access to the 4th largest gas field in the world. Cabo Delgado, terrible war already underway with South African troops there defending Western companies. And I think when you put that kind of damage, both that there's victims and villains in the climate story, it really would help us to begin to, especially as economists, to enumerate what it is that is Africa's owed and then how to pay it. And usually it's 3 things. It's loss and damage, the kind of devastation that occurred in those cyclones in Mozambique. We would add to Mozambique Malawi and Zimbabwe, which were hit in 2019 by that cyclone wave. Madagascar, now a terrible drought. And then up the coast, Kenya, and in fact the Horn of Africa with locusts that are, again, a product of the climate, the changing conditions. Those, to me, represent sites where Africans, and I work closely with a Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance and other networks across the continent, saying real justice would require the loss and damage be compensated by those who did it. A polluter pays. It's not a very radical argument. It's what environmental economics is based on, and internalizing externalities. And secondly, there's adaptation and resilience costs that we're now beginning to see must be borne. And we must have, climate proofing of our cities, irrigation for drying out fields. All sorts of things are required now that weren't. And then thirdly, we need to compensate Africans for not being able to industrialize. Just as you said, that there's no import substitution prospect with high carbon intensive manufacturing capacity, because that space has been taken by the North and by the BRICS. So those three elements of repaying Africans over the period ahead, I think, are critical. And it's very interesting to ask them, what price would that come at? Because typically, $100 billion a year, Hillary Clinton promised in the Copenhagen Accord in 2009. She was the Secretary of State, and that was a sort of sweetener to bribe support from many countries. Oh, there'll be a green climate fund and there'll be other climate finance. Well, that hasn't worked out well. We can talk about some of the reasons. Carbon markets, for example, and offsets have been terrible disappointments. And secondly, I think that, let's say, misdirection of some of these funds mean that the people really most adversely affected by the climate crisis aren't getting the resources. So in these mistakes that have been made the last 10, 12 years since Copenhagen, we should learn some lessons that I hope in Glasgow will motivate. I know it's motivating many of my colleagues in civil society who are making very clear demands that the climate debt be put back. You might recall, Rob, that Todd Stern, the then main negotiator at the UNFCCC for the US State Department, said in Copenhagen, we recognize we put the carbon up there. We're the source of this historic problem. Over 500 billion, gigatons out of 2.5 trillion. So about a fifth of the world's problem can be traced to US industrialization and fossil fuels. But he said, as for reparations, I just categorically reject that. And he did it because of the US Senate. He couldn't get anything at all through in any case, and had to make a sort of pseudo treaty. And that unfortunately then took the case of a Paris Climate Agreement clause saying we forgive liabilities if we sign on this agreement, that the North or the BRICS, because it's, number one is the US historically, number two is China, Russia, Brazil, India is there, South Africa a little bit further down, along with Germany, UK, Canada, Japan, as the big polluters historically. But us paying that debt, and I speak to you now from the global North, Johannesburg's, middle-class suburbs where the universities are. Those of us in the global North, and those of us who care about economics and internalizing externalities so market imperfections are addressed, we have to take it on. Now, what should we pay? What is the cost per ton? Now, the Stiglitz and Stern work put it at $40 to $80, but new work puts it at $3,000, right? And I think that's one of the most interesting questions. We obviously can't cost massive damage, huge losses of life. Insurance companies do. 60% of the loss and damage in the West has been covered the last couple of years, 4% for the global South, in contrast. But let's say that we go into some mode of ethical multilateralism, not, by the way, a multilateralism based on making profits. The way I fear, Mark Carney and the kind of financiers are thinking about $100 trillion green economy and a transition fund, if you get the market rate of return to attract all those, unit trusts and big institutional investors in. That's what he's after. And I don't think we can do that. You can see what the market is doing. The price of coal, the price of oil, the price of gas are record highs right now. Capitalism is sending all the wrong signals about whether markets can fix this problem on their own. So I think now the reparations, as African Americans have demanded justly for their enslavement and Jim Crow and all the racism that continues in Black Lives Matter, I think that just as well goes for African lives and a climate debt movement. I can feel it from groups like Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance and WOMEN, a feminist alliance, and Friends of the Earth, and many groups are saying, yeah, we should get back to that. Bill McKibben wrote a beautiful piece in the New Yorker in December 2020. And Naomi Klein has been a great proponent of paying the climate debt, recognizing what's due. Joe Stiglitz called for some of this to be on the agenda, even and advocating climate sanctions against the United States, really thinking about what can be done to acknowledge that the world's greatest market failure, as Nick Stern puts it, is the climate crisis. We have to be able to address that in the field of economics.
Well, in reading some of your writings in recent years and actually even recent months, I saw you underscore people like Dr. Hansen, the famous James Hansen from Climate Science. I saw Greta Thunberg's intensity in saying, you guys paint a picture like you're doing something, but you're not really doing it. And I've seen an awful lot of people, which you might call with the habit structure, that whatever we're going to do, markets are going to do it. But in your writing, you seem to be pretty clear that faith in markets is a bit of a false god given the scope and the scale of this challenge. What do you think? What are the 5 things, if you were the czar of Glasgow COP26, what are the 5 things you'd say, we're not walking out of this room until I get those things?
Well, it's not hard for me to draw up a list because the climate justice movement has done precisely that. There are roughly a half a dozen ways to frame what should happen. Maybe just as a preface, I think everyone, including James Hansen, who called the Paris Climate Agreement bullshit for not having sufficient emissions cuts. He said it's a fraud, a fake. And Greta Thunberg, as you said, even just in September, has said blah, blah, blah is what we're getting from our global elites in the sort of fake negotiations in the UNFCCC. Blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean anything, does it? So I think if I were there with the forces that are on the street, they'll be out there, they're blocking roads. Manhattan was shut down a little bit by Extinction Rebellion and the Sunrise Youth and the Fridays for Future, Greta Thunberg's movement. Very, very inspiring, aren't they? And it seems to me what they're asking, in addition to the greenhouse gas cuts, right, the dramatic cuts so that we get to a genuine, not net zero, but a zero carbon emissions and methane emissions. Let me give you the 5 that then come up logically. I happen to spend today with our leading trade unionists affected in the metal sector, right? Steel, aluminium, the smelting sectors, deep mining, auto production, heavy industry, petrochemicals. And what they're asking for is a just transition, and I think they have every right to do so. They've had some relatively high pay compared to other workers, but the devastation of communities where coal-fired power plants are shutting down, as well as the big industrial facilities, that really requires subsidization to reboot the economy. Some of it can be done with renewable energy in those sites. The eastern side of South Africa can be retooled from a huge coal site. 85% of the coal I'm using to power this laptop is from our one parastatal agency, and it could be turned because it's one big powerful institution. And there's a bit of rhetoric. Unfortunately, they also think gas is a transition fuel. But I think that would be the just transition to take care of workers and communities in energy, in transport, but also the corporate agriculture system with its high emissions from fertilizers and pesticides, urbanization processes which need to be rejigged, production systems, consumption, where the Western materialist mode, we have to change that, and disposal because of so much methane that escapes from landfills. A second area, redressing social injustices around particularly gender, race, indigenous people, and migrants and refugees, as you've said, and especially future generations. Those are constituencies that really haven't had their say in the UNFCCC. Third, technology. How can we ensure that the false solutions or nuclear energy or dangerous forms of geoengineering are dispensed with, and that we actually go for genuine nature-based solutions, not the sort of GMO crops and things, but a genuine, say, soil science that rejigs our relationship in which carbon can be sunk and sequestered properly. But also the intellectual property, that is held back. We saw that with the COVID-19 vaccine. We call it vaccine apartheid, in which the North has just kept all of these vaccines and kept them under intellectual property for a few big pharma corps. So getting rid of intellectual property on solar and wind and other important technologies. And then moving to the fourth, which I think is going to be the hardest because it involves taking power over the fossil fuels in the reserves of the big oil companies, coal companies, gas companies, and really forcing them to declare that these are stranded assets. They're unburnable carbon and they should be written down. And partly that's going to require the $6 trillion or so of annual subsidies that states give fossil fuels to be removed. And then finally, I think on the financing side, I've mentioned already, the carbon markets have been a disaster. And it's partly, as you say, you can't expect a market solution to a problem where the bankers who are managing this can't even control their own industry. And you see that, I think, with the financialization, because of quantitative easing, the Buffett indicator, the measure of financial asset overvaluation, right? The market capitalization over GDP, that's gone to unprecedented highs. In this country, 400%, in the US, 240, way out of historic whack. And what that does is push up a lot of ethereal assets, including carbon. So the right to pollute, privatization of the air, shall we say, selling the right to pollute becomes a speculative commodity. And as it did in 2006 and 2008, it goes way up, crashes. April 2020, as it had risen again to become the world's best performing commodity, it crashed again because of the lockdowns and the financial chaos. And we fear now with the financial markets at way overvalued ratios, we're going to see another crash of carbon, and that faith that markets could do climate financing will be blown. So we really need to move away from the commodification of climate finance and an acknowledgement that there should be the climate reparations, that the funding flows shouldn't be loans and high-priced speculative venture capital ideas that you see floating around for new blended funds, but instead grants. And these are just simple reparations that are really owed to people who are the victims. They did the least to cause the problem, but in relative terms, they're getting hit the hardest. And I think, Rob, that's where a good economist will say, yeah, a reparations payment, one that would not just be a fee to continue the practice of polluting. You pay a fee, you keep it going. But instead, a fine, and then we would ban it. And the last point is, we've done that before with another macro problem for the environment, which were the ozone hole expansion because of chlorofluorocarbons. In 1987 in the UN, even with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, there was an agreement to cap and then to reduce over the next 7 years to a total phase-out by 1996. The Montreal Protocol then solved this problem of the expanding ozone hole, not through a market technique, cap and trade or emissions trading, but through banning. And the state has to come in at this point because it is a genuine existential risk to all of us, isn't it?
I want to come back to your political economy, meaning there are vested interests on the other side. When we talk about just transition, it makes me feel good not only for helping people who've been hurting, but it makes me also feel good because people will not, out of fear, resist the transitions that we have to make. So I'm in a place where I see what people call the merchants of doubt, or I see people fomenting social media, fear and despair in a place like West Virginia, as the scholar Bob Pollan has taught me. And I guess what I'm trying to understand in the context of Africa is there are a whole lot of stranded assets that people may be willing to fight to extract more value from in Russia, in Saudi Arabia, in South Africa, in the United States, in Canada, and more. How do we, as political economists, not looking at markets in isolation, but looking at political economy as an integrated system where power, meaning wealth, among other things, tries to influence the enforcement of the rules, the making of the rules, the type of regulations. And how do we illuminate who's getting in the way of the survival of mankind in that?
That's the right big framing, isn't it? Because at some point we're going to have to use every tool, including markets, to prevent extinction. And I think if we use one example that's going to be on the agenda for years to come, which is imposing a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a climate tax on international trade, I would guess that the kind of Trump supporters in the blue-collar community in the US, the working class, who said, we're getting undermined by jobs moving abroad, they'll be quite happy to hear that, okay, well, we will now put a block on, say, steel or aluminum that comes to the US from South Africa because of the high carbon intensity, the long-distance shipping and so forth. But it does strike me that we've got to get this kind of politics right. The political economy shouldn't just be a protectionist and, dare I say, imperialist European Union, which is going to start the process with the carbon border adjustment mechanism in 2023. It'll hit South Africa very hard. Britain's about to hit us very hard with long-distance air transport taxes, which I think are perfectly justified. But our tourist industry, which is too much, neo-colonial, Brit-centered, needs to decolonize. But in doing so, let's make sure that a just transition can be financed, because the revenues that I can anticipate Treasury, in the US with big deficits looking greedily at, more revenues, if you put on a higher and higher carbon border adjustment mechanism, those really should go back to the people affected. A just transition financed from the reparations, a down payment that I think could come from the revenues from a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Look, this is controversial because in speaking about this today with my mates in the trade unions, there's no consensus about how you get that kind of sanctions, especially against a country like South Africa. But you would agree, Rob, I'm sure all economists would agree, when Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement in June 2017, as Nicolas Sarkozy on the right and Naomi Klein on the left said, we need to have sanctions against the United States. We need to punish them. We need to make sure that that unfair advantage that the US producers now have, because they're not in the Paris Agreement, we need to make sure that we correct the markets. I'd love to see a sort of logic in which we do hit trade. Now, you've said a great deal, of course you're right, about all the ways Africa's deindustrialization through globalization and its reprimarization, in other words, a return to primary cash crops. Our GDP that used to be 22% manufacturing down to about 11 across the continent, South Africa especially. But what about a relocalization that, particularly with new technologies, and we could get 3D printing and set up all sorts of manufacturing operations that could overcome what we have traditionally felt, which was the disadvantage of relatively small and atomized markets on this continent compared to a massive production capacity in East Asia. And when we deindustrialized, because we imported those East Asian goods, it was partly because we didn't count the carbon costs of the production and the shipping. And if we can do that and make sure we have a deglobalization that better balances, as our greatest economist here, Samir Amin, put it, a delinking from the most destructive circuits. This is not being like a Burma or Albania or North Korea. It's not being an autarkic project. It's being one that's sensible about things like, are we in international financial markets doing okay? What about our mining and the extractive industries? Are we getting our values worth? And again, if you look at these relationships, the answer is obviously not. And many of the relationships are political economic in explanation. We had a massacre in a platinum mine because the man who's now our president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was the main owner here. And the mine was Lonmin, and he emailed in a request during the Wildcat strike in 2012. Thomas Piketty begins his book with this terrible incident. And 34 people were massacred because President Ramaphosa, who has apologized for these emails, he said, look, I shouldn't have sent them. But he said, don't treat this like a labor dispute. These are dastardly criminals, these mine workers on strike. He sent that to the colleagues at Lonmin, to the police minister, to the mining minister. It's that kind of, let's say, a distortion of our own democratic possibility when our own leaders are also making a lot of money out of the kind of globalization that underdevelops or maldevelops. And I think a deglobalization, look, it's happening anyway. You know as well as anyone, Rob, that trade to GDP peaks in 2007, FDI to GDP peaks in 2008, cross-border financial flows peaks 2008. They crash in 2020. They're coming up again. But frankly, we're on a pretty steady downward decline in economic globalization and the value chains at the heart of it, which had 28% in 2007 of a typical manufactured product within a global value chain went down to 21% by 2019 before COVID. I think these are the kinds of questions about, well, maybe this is our opportunity to genuinely build back better with less dependency on the worst tendencies in the world economy.
How do you see right now the American administration? You mentioned Trump should be penalized, and now it feels like America's coming back to the table. But are they coming back to the table, which you might call in neoliberal robes, or are they coming back to the table in a more, which you might call, pragmatic and urgent sense?
Well, John Kerry projects that urgency, but the question is whether those 5 objectives, in addition to the obvious one, mandatory, accountable emissions cuts, they're binding, penalties if you don't do them. That would be obviously something everyone agrees on. But the other 5 aspects we would call climate justice. Kerry wants nothing to do with those. He's just shown no indication of any solidarity with those most adversely affected. For example, as you see in the huge struggles of First Nations, of Native Americans against pipelines in Minnesota, in the West and all. I think these are the kinds of moments where the U.S. and its fracturing, right, and the inability of the center to hold, Biden's falling, popularity and the inability to win even basic infrastructure deals in his own party in the Senate. These do reflect a quagmire. He's really found a ceiling as to what can be done inside the system. And that's why the external forces, the social movements, a civil rights type movement, which made such big changes, okay, it was assimilated in some ways, but an anti-apartheid movement, which forced even Ronald Reagan to sign off on a bill that included sanctions against this country, South Africa, when it was white ruled. Things that you wouldn't expect. I saw that, for example, with feminist movements against sexual harassment the last few years, and especially Black Lives Matter, to tear down these statues of the traitors of the Civil War. They're so insulting. Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, right? These kind of things I thought would never go. And I think those are aspects where if the left has no illusions with Biden, the way, unfortunately, you'd have to agree, the left still maintained illusions with Clinton in the late 90s, with Obama in the 2010s. But it's pretty clear with both Biden and Kamala Harris that there's no real reach out to bring in the Bernie Sanders wing and generally to dismiss that force. And I think you do see the bubbling of an international left also disgusted with the inability of John Kerry to deliver, or Joe Biden's broken promises on fossil fuel drilling, or the inability, for example, to deal even in a place like California with their drilling rights that Gavin Newsom, the governor, continues to offer even while his state's on fire. So let's say that the gap between the elites and the base is ever widening, and there may be something very valuable in that, because the illusions that a neoliberal version of a kind of corporate limited democracy, the illusions in that many would have fallen away quite quickly.
But we go back, if you would say, to the Franklin Roosevelt New Deal up through the time of Lyndon Johnson. And there was a very kind of strong sense that Roosevelt increased the credibility of government, though people did fight with it, even in 1938. But I know one of my co-founders of INET, Bill Janeway's father, Elliot, wrote a book called The Struggle for Survival. I see more recently, Naomi Klein's older brother, Seth, has written a book called The Good War, which is about the need to override, which you might call the faith in the market system to provide for us, and to create an analogy to war preparation. At the same time, and this is really the form of a question, in the United States, it used to be there was a pendulum. The people that were on the Lyndon Johnson side or the Franklin Roosevelt's side believed more in government, less in markets. The people on the Ronald Reagan, Barry Goldwater side believed more in markets and less in governance. But we now have a cynicism on the left about the capture of governance by concentrated wealth and power. And I think the despondency, perhaps, that brought Donald Trump to the table by saying the system is rigged. And in many of the states, like Michigan, where I come from, he was victorious in 2016. How do we go to Seth Klein or Franklin Roosevelt's recipe, seeing that the market system unbridled is not sufficient, and re-engage, or reinvigorate, I should say, the faith in expertise and faith in governance to do the job? When it's really literally war preparation, what you're afraid of is extermination and there's no choice. Are people yet in the frame of mind where they can look at climate change as that ominous, that we need to change and we need to pledge our faith in a different way of doing things? You have a lot of experience down in the trenches and seeing all of these dynamics, but how do you convince the general public, which is cynical?
Well, it's not really up to, it's not to me to change perspectives. I will try to serve the cynicism. If it's not going to turn into a right wing, in this country xenophobic, in the US, all manner of, sort of paleocon tendencies. And yet what I do see there is quite exciting, insofar as, let's say, some opposition will scare Joe Biden and maybe even a Joe Manchin into doing something. Now, in the 1930s, I think you'd agree, Rob, if Franklin Roosevelt didn't have a very serious communist party with the Soviet Union, sort of there, and two socialist parties, that New Deal may not have really amounted to much more than what Biden's talking about. So I think if there had been from Bernie Sanders some sort of break to the left, that might have changed those power balances so that threat. We certainly felt it in this country in July. You might have seen some of the news that there were riots and looting. We had about 400 deaths in a period of about a week because of just desperation. Some would call it some conspiracy or some sort of residual support for the prior president, Jacob Zuma, from his Zulu ethnic community, but I don't think so. I think there was a powder keg, it blew, and what the president here, Cyril Ramaphosa, did was to immediately come forward with a grant to try to, calm things down. It's not the New Deal, it's not a social policy we're talking of, it's a minor grant of about $22 a month, but this is the sort of thing in a way that, to be a good reformer, you'd agree with me, Rob, you actually need some revolutionaries. To be a jam maker on the inside, as Jesse Jackson would teach me back in the 80s and the rainbow days, you need the tree shakers on the outside, and maybe that fruit that falls down would be right. I see, for example, in Glasgow, I see such disgust and cynicism, so well put by Greta Thunberg, blah, 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 such disgust that a delegitimization of those negotiators probably is inevitable, which then compels activists to say, well, what's our plan B? Because the idea that we've got, some Montreal protocol that'll, be like 1987 and solve the problem, that's not happening. The powerful forces of the fossil fuel industry and, frankly, capitalism wanting profits from the status quo are overwhelming. So there it's where Naomi Klein, in her book, This Changes Everything, I think it was exactly right to look to forces at the base. The Dakota Access Pipeline in the US probably woke people up to just how much of the fossil fuels travels and how easy it is actually sometimes just to stop. It's that, let's say, Achilles heel in logistics. We've seen it the last few weeks in much of the world, right, where the shipping, the containers aren't sufficient, the logistics at the ports are breaking down. And it's in those respects, I think, a blockadia that's more and more skilled and capable. The project I worked with called the EJ Atlas, Environmental Justice Atlas, actually has 3,000 of these blockadia projects of various kinds, some fossil fuel and petrochem and so forth. But I think that's actually still got a lot of weight. Now, why would I say that after such huge disasters, ecological, economic, public health? It's partly because what I've seen in Africa the last 10 years, you probably remember in Tunisia, in early 2011 after a young man set himself on fire, Mohammed Bouazizi, because of an IMF structural adjustment program that called for a value-added tax imposed. And, he set himself on fire. There was an Arab Spring, a North African uprising that really shook out a lot of bad governments. And it wasn't just there, but all down the continent. Revolts have happened. We are having one right now in Sudan after a coup. I could go through a dozen countries where we had at least some progress through changes of government, through popular protest. Now, I'm in a country, in a city that's called the protest capital of the world. The World Economic Forum rates our working class over the last 15 years as the most angry and confrontational. We have what are called service protests in the communities. We've had a student movement that demanded and actually won through sustained protest-free university education. Fees must fall. And we've seen women rise up in various moments against the patriarchy and sexual violence. And we've seen communities demand water. Maybe most inspiringly, the activists for AIDS medicines that I've mentioned actually did defeat Big Pharma Corps, the US government, which was certainly behind trade-related intellectual property system, and an AIDS denialist president. At a time, none of us thought that 1,000 activists, the Treatment Action Campaign was their name, could actually, these are people who were stigmatized, they were suffering from opportunistic infections, and none of us, sitting in our academic armchairs, believed that this bottom-up force would actually make the change that, as I mentioned, have given us 52 life expectancy rises up to 65 over about a dozen years. Those are the sorts of things, Rob, that in a most unequal city in the world, Johannesburg, the most unequal country, with so much residual racism, so much patriarchy and the ecological destruction, I think they all come together. And I remember when I was looking at all of this, when I was in my late teens, early 20s at Swarthmore, this thinking, can all of these processes be reduced to market relations or utility or the price mechanism? Clearly not. And I think that's where I've had a chance, at least in my intellectual work, to scan varieties of literature and especially from the African continent, critical dependencia, right, dependency theory like Samir Amin or Ben Magubani, Dani Naboderi, who really have said a big part of our problem is world capitalism. I never met a Walter Rodney, one of the greats, how Europe underdeveloped Africa. But, we have a great tradition in this country, and we have African feminists who are very important contributors to thinking about social reproduction and how that cheapens African labor for multinational capital and extractive industries. All of these do come together in a way I hope more economists will, also be able to broaden out to capture in their thinking.
Well, shifting gears just a bit, we've been talking about your insights, your formative years, move that towards climate change. But there's another dimension, and it bridges to climate change, which is it doesn't feel like we have what I'll call a harmonious world system at this point. Whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or concerns about danger in the Taiwan Straits, the seeming increasing polarization between the United States and China, or at a deeper, I'll call more philosophical level, how the cherishing of individual freedom that underpins American ideology is not necessarily shared in the countries that are born into my thousands of years of Eastern philosophy. And as I look now, I think there are dangers related to climate collaboration and potential war and possibly nuclear weapons being used. But I see you've done a lot of work on what you call deglobalization. We've talked about that a bit here, and about the nature of the BRICS. INET in December of 2018, along with Justin Lin at Beijing University, did a conference on China and the development of Africa. Many of the times when I visited Africa, I hear people saying, being simplistic, you're building forts, and they're building ports and highways and schools and hospitals. But I see tension, particularly related to the kind of frighteningly authoritarian dimensions of China. I see this world system as in turmoil itself. how do you, and I've had the good fortune of watching a video that you had on Vimeo recently, which was a presentation related to the BRICS, and particularly a zoom lens that in the last third of it about the relationship between China and India. So I'm painting a big picture here, but how do you see the evolution of the world system? How do you see the potential for, which I call reharmonization or collaboration? What are the necessary ingredients in your mind, and where are the dangers?
Well, it's just great to be able to think at the biggest possible scale, and I've been inspired by the late Emanuel Wallerstein to think, are the semi-peripheral countries going to be assimilated upwards, or will they sink back into degradation, as some would predict for South Africa? And I think in our case here, the hope that South Africa could play a humane role, certainly Nelson Mandela articulated this, Thabo Mbeki in his own way did, a humane role in changing global geopolitics, that hope faded quickly. And much of that was because a durable problem, which I think is really coming from the factories of East Asia, called overproduction. So it means vast overcapacity, which in turn, very logically, all of our colleagues in the Chinese Academy of Marxism and other, reputable sites for looking at overproduction are pretty clear that this overcapacity now is creating this Belt and Road, this drive outwards. That's not that different if we go back to, say, Rosa Luxemburg's argument in 1913 about the drive of imperial forces, colonial forces, to take overproductive capital, export capital, and push it into colonies to find some rates of return. If that's the core problem, right, an overaccumulation, overproduction that has to be displaced, then the geopolitical tensions are logically following. I just wish it weren't the case that China and the US, particularly I think driven by Washington, the potential for Washington-Moscow again in conflict, that these are, I think, driven by the most notoriously militant and aggressive force in world history, the Pentagon, the CIA, the State Department. I'd rather, in defense of values of freedom and genuine liberty, that these pressures come from below. You see it all over, in China, you see it from people wanting their sovereignty or their rights of some degree of self-determination in Mongolia and Upper Mongolia and Tibet, and in, of course, the Uyghur people, Hong Kong Democrats, workers, Marxist students even. So their fighting back against that repression is often inspiring. Sometimes they win. I mean, if you can find your way to a VPN to get around the Great Wall of China, full respect. What I'd see then is as China moves out, especially it moves into Kashmir, right, in the India-Pakistan border where they're trying to go to a new port, Gadar. It's actually an old port and trying to revitalize it, or they may use, Karachi. They definitely want a route from the Arabian Sea directly to West China, which means they wouldn't be so vulnerable on those, long straits and complicated aspects of the South China Sea and of South Asia, where I think U.S. militarism is a threat to them. And likewise, their attempt to build all these sort of islands in other people's Filipino and Vietnamese waters represents, again, some of that awful defensiveness that you see from China. So maybe if they do cut this pipeline, road, and rail through Kashmir, very dangerous area, very contested by Kashmiris who want self-determination, maybe that would go some way to limiting these tensions. As you've seen them, China and India on that border have led to dozens of deaths just last year, and fisticuffs where soldiers were throwing each other over the Himalayan mountain ranges into freezing water. They're not allowed to use guns in that area. And those kinds of tragic, let me call them the breaking of the bricks, or construction workers know there's a term, spalling, in which bricks that seem like a nice solid wall are actually, crumbling or falling apart. There are other ways that the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, with so much hope economically. Jim O'Neill from Goldman Sachs writing in 2001 about these being the building bricks of the 21st century. They peaked when they offered some new initiatives, a BRICS New Development Bank, a contingent reserve arrangement, alternative to the International Monetary Fund. There were lots of prospects for setting up a BRICS vaccine center here in Johannesburg that could have, when announced in 2018, possibly suggested a way to deal with the kind of COVID, vaccine apartheid of the West. never happened. Contingent reserve arrangement, never happened. The BRICS got more power in the IMF by buying voting rights. The 2015 recapitalization of the IMF saw China going up 37% and Brazil 23%, India 11%, even Russia 8%. But what did they do with that? I mean, you kind of get potential new heads of the IMF, but the BRICS are never there. It's always some European. I think they took the European-only signs from the apartheid era, right, Rob? And they just put them on the managing director door of the IMF. And to have a David Malpass or even a Jim Yong Kim, coming out of nowhere really to run the World Bank just because they have an American citizenship just makes no sense. And when the big BRICS try some of that, they're quickly co-opted. Also, I've never seen the BRICS really raise any objection to IMF structural adjustment. These two moments of Keynesianism under Georgieva recently, or under Dominic Strauss-Kahn in 2009, the expansion of special drawing rights in both cases, the potential to relax on that fiscal conservatism to get us all over this, that seems to be just whimsical, short-term, and certainly we're under a rigid austerity, the worst I've ever seen here. And the IMF has a $4.3 billion loan to enforce that they made last year. It was a loan full of corruption as well, as you'd expect. These are the kinds of things that make me think these BRICS are not really changing. They're not really offering an alternative. I've studied each of the BRICS New Development Bank loans here in detail. They're just as bad as anything from 18th and H Street in Washington. And instead, I think these can be described as amplifiers. We rely on a Brazilian dependency theorist, a great theorist from the left of the tradition, not like Cardoso from the right, but his name was Rui Mauro Marini. And his term for this, let's say, deputy sheriff or local ally of imperialism, his term, sub-imperialism, right? A layer. Wallerstein called it the semi-periphery. But you have to actually look at geopolitically, which way are they lining up? Sometimes they talk left and they certainly have anti-imperial rhetoric. But it's actually when they're fitting in rather destructive ways to the rest of the world economy or the UNFCCC, the climate talks where Barack Obama in 2009 very successfully co-opted Wen Jiabao from China and Manmohan Singh from India and Jacob Zuma from South Africa and even Lula da Silva from Brazil to basically destroy the idea of binding commitments in the Conference of the Parties in Copenhagen. These make me reflect upon not a potential alternative through the existing power structure, but rather one that assimilates and amplifies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm always drawn to the book that Orville Schell and John DeBerry wrote called Wealth and Power, because what they essentially said was there's thousands of years of Chinese history, and then there's the Opium War and the Japanese invasion and a woundedness. And then there's the United States, which received the baton from Great Britain as the world leader. And these two tectonic plates are going to clash with different philosophical systems, the desire to maintain control, and the woundedness of those historic episodes in China. And as I'm watching that process unfold, some Chinese scholars who I greatly admire at Tsinghua University, Academy of Social Science places, will say to me, Rob, why does your country preach that we should become like you? Have you ever looked at the public opinion polls, not just in the United States, but in Germany and Sweden and England, and look at how few people are happy with what you're doing? Why would we want to emulate that? And so I sense there's a yearning within China to regain its sense of national dignity, to be, what you might call, accepted as a leading partner. And I think the Americans make that into a wound of America being displaced. They, at one very simple level, they're worried about scale. A place that's 4 times as large as ours, once they do economic development, can do a whole lot more to influence the world in national defense and everything with a lower tax rate than we would have because they have 4 times the population. So you see all of this suspicion. And I guess what I'm trying to say is what's fomenting the discord is in part because the BRICS have assimilated, in part because the West isn't thriving. Nobody knows where to turn.
Yes, I think we're in that period. It could be, prior to a really serious Great Depression, if the Chinese real estate market takes down parts of the financial system and there's interlocks and overexposure from Western investors. Yes, it could be just like, again, a 29 to 33 precursor to a long, terrible depression. We've learned lessons, of course, quantitative easing to print money, but how long can that be done? I think those are the right big questions, but to get to the specific one, how does it feel in a place like Johannesburg, where Chinese investors are, they're all over. Our biggest rail investment was massive locomotive purchases for exporting of coal, now going to China more and more, but massive corruption. Those really were write-offs. Or a huge special economic zone in the north of the country, also full of corruption. Or Chinese loans to our big coal-fired power plants, rife with corruption. In fact, I credit the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US for identifying Hitachi bribing our ruling party, the ANC, and actually paying a fine for that. So let's say that if you're in a place like South Africa, and it's much worse if you're in eastern Zimbabwe with the biggest diamond find, well, as even Robert Mugabe said on his birthday a couple of years before he died, we had $15 billion of diamonds, and because we have these deals with the Chinese, we can only find $2 billion worth. The rest has vanished. Or new coal-fired power plants in Zimbabwe from China. The Kenyans have just resisted one. What I see, though, if there's a pattern, Rob, it's not really that different. It's not about building schools and maybe a stadium here or there for symbolic purposes, but it's following the tracks of what Western companies have done. Really, in this country since 1652, they settled, but they used the resources here, and they built ports, yes. They built railroads, yes. But they were often to go inland to the mines and the plantations, right? Those roads and railroads took the resources of the continent out. Under the Western first, imperial and colonial system, and then the Bretton Woods system and all of the global trading systems, which have so severely disadvantaged Africa with our, let me call it again, unequal ecological exchange. Far more in wealth is being extracted with the compensation or the investment in infrastructure, the hard currency revenues, some royalties and taxes, some jobs, very much below the outflow of the natural wealth, right? A real net negative. It's the only region of the world, if you look at the World Bank's natural capital accounts, that show Africa being systematically looted. So China does a lot of that because it's producing things for Western consumption. And to me, then, it doesn't really look that much different, except for a little bit of rhetoric about we're not going to be as interventionist in your politics. Sometimes they are. I mean, just as a trivial example, you wouldn't let the Dalai Lama come to South Africa. 3 times his visa was denied because of Beijing pressure, even to visit Archbishop Desmond Tutu on his 80th birthday 11 years ago. That's the kind of, let's say, control freakery that maybe in that psychological sense you have a point. But really, I think the big story is still the search for profit. Rosa Luxemburg, in her book, Accumulation of Capital, she put it so well that capital runs into crises, then it needs to spatially expand, a spatial fix, a globalization process. That's different than the way Lenin, Bukharin, Hilferding, and others described inter-imperial rivalry. For Luxemburg, it was capital reaching deeper into the non-capitalist, reaching into matriarchal systems, reaching into ethnic communities, reaching into nature, reaching into whatever forms of states were beginning to come up, and just taking a primitive accumulation, an accumulation by dispossession. I think that's still what Western companies do, and now what Chinese companies have done. And it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, except the language and the culture.
Yeah. Do you, coming back to Africa for a moment, somebody put a puzzle before me recently. They said the capital markets allow Norway at 1% above inflation to borrow money to put in place solar panels. In Africa, they charge them 9% to put in the solar panel, to borrow to put in the solar panels. But Norway's dark 3 months of the year, And the place to put solar panels to get the most bang for the buck or renminbi or whatever should be in the equatorial regions. And then it was presented to me that this isn't just about development of Africa. This is about climate and survival for all of us. How do we create a collective institution which you might call takes the risk premium out or shares the burden of the risk premium with the African countries when we will benefit from the transition they make? How do we inspire that collective energy? And you've alluded to the presence of corruptions and other things. How do we overcome some of what colonialism has developed within the African continent and emerging countries all over the world?
Well, I've been looking for ways that you could do a climate reparations payment. So your version of climate finance, you've nailed it, because you've said the logic of lending to an African sovereign, 9% is reasonable. That's what South Africa pays, but you pay much higher further up the continent. And then the next question is, well, obviously that makes doing the solar, doing the wind, extremely expensive. You're paying such a high rate. And the premium, it's risk. There's a currency depreciation. So if we're looking at the actual real effective interest rate in our local currency terms, it's impossible to finance. So we just have very little of it, don't we? So the market isn't working to achieve public and merit good objectives, to end, for example, the terrible searches like in Mozambique, as I mentioned, the fourth largest gas field, the coal fields in this country, which continue and continue. There's natural gas and fracking going on in Namibia and Botswana, in one of the most beautiful and pristine areas of Africa. We've go on and on about offshore drilling for oil and for gas all over. And in Uganda, very sensitive places, and people are being disrupted. So could we pay countries? Now, there's an Ecuadorian example that inspires me. You might have heard of Yasuni. It's on the eastern side. It's a national park bordering Peru. And what their then president, Rafael Correa, authorized some of his economists, Carlos Larrea maybe most prominently, to do was to negotiate with Europe, especially Norway and Germany and Italy, to get a down payment on the climate debt so that if there was a $3.6 billion grant, not a loan, but a grant to Ecuador, they would then forego the oil revenues and they'd leave the oil under the soil. They'd leave this Yasuni Park, which happens to be the single most biodiverse hotspot in the world, untapped. And because a German liberal wanted to instead play with the carbon markets, right? His name isn't important, but he was the German Federal Minister of Development Aid. His name was Dirk Niebel, and he just wanted to play the carbon markets, and he insisted that the money would go through there and it would have a return, it would be an offset for German companies. And that's the logic that'll get, this kind of profiteering mentality of the West to the point where we just give up. Because if we can keep oil under the soil, gas under the fields of Rovuma in Mozambique, because the North pays a down payment, or instead of me paying my tax money to send South African National Defense Force boys and bullets and bombs and body bags, which is what's happening now. We're spending about $70 million and sending 1,500 troops to defend ExxonMobil and Total and China National Petroleum. If we can arrange that the more rational approach is not to, it's to pay Mozambique not to extract. Now, you've asked about, very difficult places like Saudi Arabia and Russia, who have huge climate debts to the rest of us, as South Africa does. But it does seem to me for a Mozambique or a Uganda or a Kenya, which is also doing oil exploration all over the continent, oil and gas is being drilled. We really should pay governments. Now, you're right, corruption means if you can't pay a government in good faith, Mozambique's classic, can we find a way to pay people? What kind of a basic income grant might go to the ordinary people in a place, Cabo Delgado, the province where all this gas is, so that the Islamic threat there would be reduced because an income stream would come in. Could one do that without the state? What kind of pilots have we seen? The one that's exciting, Rob, is in Namibia, a place called Ochivero, and Germans, Lutherans, knowing that 100 years before their ancestors had committed genocide on the Herero and the Nam people. They've just recognized that this year in the government. But they began to make these €10 a month gifts to every person in this village. And they really got, like many basic income grant pilot projects show, terrific results on socioeconomic, on cultural, on unemployment, on crime. All of these major indicators prove very, very positive. And I think that might be a future for taking a climate finance payment in areas especially suffering from the droughts, the floods, the new malaria threats, the extreme storms, the devastation of locusts, all of these things that have been attacking Africa as climate effects. Well, we in the global north, here, me in Johannesburg too, we really do owe a climate debt that could be turned into something, where the multiplier effect of $1 being spent in a local area. And the last point on this, because you've raised the question very appropriately, should foreign investors, should foreign lenders try to take those high rates of return when, as your currency crashes, they become utterly unpayable? Well, instead, what about producing our solar panels and our wind turbines internally? What can we do to up the manufacturing base? We can quite easily do it in this country, but right now we're being undercut. Of course, if anybody tries to do solar panels, they import it from China much cheaper. And I think that would be one of the other dilemmas. How can we start something that's not necessarily economic? It might have to be state-run, a massive ESCOM, this is our major parastatal, switching from coal and switching into the grid and microgrids and all the, particularly the electricity storage, pumped storage, where you pump water up the hill during the daytime and let it come down at night. So when it's a cloudy day or when the wind isn't blowing, then you've got storage, or molten salt, where you have concentrated solar. So we aren't so reliant on lithium. I mean, the rare earth minerals that are being dug up for the green economy are quite frightening because of all the damage being done and the social resistance. So I think those would be some of the ways we'd want to frame the challenges in the coming decade of getting Africa off that Western track of high carbon industrialization, of digging for oil and gas and even coal still, and instead demanding the climate debt be paid, the reparations, but properly, not in the form that would boost some dictatorship. Does that make sense to you?
Now, I remember in preparing for this, you shared with me a very powerful document from the South African, was it Federation of Trade Unions?
Yes, that's
and
right.
They talked about something called nationally determined contributions, NDC, that came from the United Nations Framework Convention. And is this national contributions related to what I'll call cumulative carbon burning? In other words, the debt we owe as reparations for how much we've toxified the atmosphere? Or tell me a little bit, and my audience, a little bit more about what the NDC is and why they were very critical about it.
Well, I wish your premise was correct, that our nationally determined contributions would have a memory as well as projections and ambitions. Because you're right, if we could say that South Africa industrialized, and frankly, it wasn't everybody who industrialized. In fact, electricity only came here into the Johannesburg townships like Soweto around 1980, because when the World Bank made their loans and the white Afrikaners set up ESCOM, they just didn't want to provide electricity to black people who weren't paid enough to be able to afford it. And finally, General Electric and reform tendencies, and so, okay, we're going to sell you some appliances, so you now need electricity in the 1980s. So that industrialization we had, a minerals energy complex, as we call it, that was very racist, right? It was a very white bias. So people like me had, enormous benefits under this system. So we would want to make sure that our nationally determined contributions are sensitive to the internal disparities that have been so extreme and still are. But let's say that the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, are what the Paris Climate Agreement insists that countries file, but it's voluntary. And there's no real policing. There's an attempt to raise the ambition. So it's an aspirational target. And in our case, the aspirational target was set this year at 440 million tons by 2030. And then there was a little revision down to 420, 5% cut. Pathetic, really tokenistic. So our activists, and you've mentioned one of the most powerful networks, potentially, which is the second largest federation. It's not the AFL-CIO, it would be sort of a change to win. It would be a second movement, around 700,000 members. The biggest union is the metal workers, a UAW type, with about 350,000. Very powerful union in some ways in the private sector. The other bigger federation, the traditional one, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, is more aligned with the African National Congress and has more public sector workers. So this one broke away because the metal workers had a very tough clash over whether to support this African National Congress after all the betrayals and failures. And as a result, with quite visionary people in that metal workers union demanding just transitions and sort of eco-socialist, and then in the South African Federation, the bigger network, that's the second biggest federation, the very charismatic leader, Zwelinzima Vavi, they are moving. In fact, they had a big conference last week towards just transition demands. Sometimes we call these million climate jobs. That's one of the campaigns at one of the allied institutes, the Alternative Information and Development Center. Sometimes it's a climate justice charter presented to Parliament demanding an emergency be declared. Sometimes it's in a climate justice coalition where this group SAFTU meets 350.org and does regular protests at the end of September, protests all over the country against the energy minister. So we're seeing quite a good variety, but that Labour is still very involved in saying, if we cut emissions from coal-fired power plants, we close down coal mines, we rethink these carbon-intensive smelters that chew up most of the electricity. About 35 companies chew 40% of the electricity in this country. If we can do that, it may require taking this big parastatal and turning it, like a ship, huge, rapid U-turn and move to renewables. But doing so without losing jobs, without losing community wealth in some of the areas where they've become dependent. I think, Rob, that's one of the beauties of living in a country with these extreme contradictions on class and race and gender and ecology, is that quite visionary people are coming out, and you find them in major trade unions. So I think SAFTU, along with the network called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, headquartered at CUNY in New York, they're really beginning to make their arguments, even if we don't have much effect on NDCs. This kind of eco-socialist, kind of green and feminist politics is moving. I hope it moves ever faster here.
Yeah. Well, in our conversation over these last 75 minutes, I think you've illustrated for a young scholar the kind of curiosity, seeking out social challenges, exploring and building and integrating lots of what you might call different historic episodes and great works in the history of social thought. As we come down the stretch here, I want to talk specifically about education. I want to make you a meta mentor electronically to our whole audience. What would you encourage a 20-year-old individual to do now, to study, to build themselves, to be of value to society over the next 50 years?
Well, Rob, you're more of a model than me in really getting in and making an impact and using ideas at the commanding heights of power. So I have full respect for what you've done in your career. But for me, it's been an alliance I've always sought with activists who I believe are producing knowledge. And I think especially if you're a young economics student and you're fed let's be quite frank, Rob, after the 2008 crash, which only about 3 or 4, Nouriel Roubini or Dean Baker or maybe Jamie Galbraith, really saw coming. And the economics profession just hasn't changed yet. I think we have to acknowledge. It may be you, like me, after graduating from a very good economics department at Swarthmore, have to become recovering economists pretty quick. For me, it was partly understanding that the financial markets, which when I went to the Wharton School, were celebrated as the most omniscient, fast clearing, and capable of moving big amounts of money. And whether it was redlining in Philadelphia or the third world debt crisis, I could see this wasn't a very effective way to allocate resources. I turned myself to a version of Marxian political economy where I was lucky to have probably the finest teacher, David Harvey.
Yes.
But you know, when I think about that, so much of the engagement that I was lucky to be involved in, anti-apartheid work, third world debt advocacy, community movements, labor, corporate campaigning with some of the greats of the 1980s, or hanging around with Bill Grider, learning about the Fed in a financial democracy campaign. Those were formative experiences that then gave me more respect, I think, and it's continued in a place like this, for activists creating friction. And just as an epistemological argument, I think, Rob, I'd conclude by saying, you know, when you see these conflicts in society, if you're a middle-class intellectual, as I was, and I am, usually, you know, you want to run the other way. You're scared. You don't want to see the conflict. We're conflict avoiders in some of these ways. But, you know, when you hear this terrible conflict, what you don't see, what I don't see mostly, from our academic armchairs, is that there are little rays of light that let the activists who are right at the site where they're either being, you know, one day they're being crushed by a repressive regime, maybe they're being co-opted the next day, maybe they're getting concessions the next day. And I think the production of knowledge, I've tried to encourage activists who are PhD students to think of this praxis epistemology. It's production of knowledge in conflict, where that heat generates light as well. I think it's that respect that I've learned, partly from making mistakes like predicting we'd never get free AIDS medicines because big pharma corps were too powerful, and having to eat my words literally weeks later when the policies changed, when TRIPS had this new exemption and the balance of forces locally changed. Things changed rapidly, all of a sudden. And I think a good young scholar with a flexible mind will recognize that and maybe get out of the, you know, ISLM and supply demand and all of those sort of more rigid ways of thinking about markets, prices, and find more inspiration in struggles for social justice and environmental justice.